Welcome. I hope you are having a wonderful night, dear viewer. Tonight, I will be telling some terrifyingly scary stories. Make sure to leave your feedback on the comments so I can make this the best experience for you. And if you have any stories you would like me to tell, you can send them through the link in the description. Let's begin. Story 1. On a Sunday afternoon, my sister and I decided to take a leisurely walk to our city's notorious square. It was a beautiful day, and we relished the opportunity to enjoy the scenery and soak in the atmosphere. Eventually, we felt the need to recharge, so we decided to stop at a nearby coffee shop to have a quick study session. As we sat there, sipping our drinks and exchanging small talk with fellow patrons, we couldn't help but marvel at the vibrant energy of our city. We shared interesting tidbits about our hometown, adding to the sense of camaraderie in the coffee shop. However, as the daylight began to wane, we realized it was time to head back and meet our parents. Just as we were about to set off on our return journey, a peculiar man approached us. "Hello," he greeted us warmly. "What a beautiful dog you have." We thanked him for his compliment, and he proceeded to explain his predicament. His son was apparently sick and needed urgent medical attention in Lula, Georgia, a few miles away from where we stood. He claimed that his sister lived there and could take care of his son while he received treatment at the hospital. Bearing a slightly desperate expression, the man sheepishly admitted that he was short $20 to cover the transportation costs. Sensing the urgency in his voice, I offered a sympathetic reply. "No, I don't have any cash on me at the moment. However, I can withdraw some from the ATM across the street." I attempted to maintain my composure, although deep down, a sense of unease started to settle within me. We were alone, surrounded by an eerie silence, and I couldn't shake off the feeling of vulnerability. Desiring the safety of a crowded place, I suggested we make our way to the nearest CVS. Fast, forwarding through our cautious journey, my sister and I eventually reached our parents' location. It was there that my father noticed the man tailing us and promptly intervened. Urging us to quickly enter the car, he firmly instructed the man to leave us alone. Following that encounter, we didn't see the man for a few days until my sister spotted him near the square, walking into a nearby hotel. The incident sent shivers down my spine, as I strongly suspected it was an attempt at human trafficking. For a while, the incident faded from my memory, lying dormant until it resurfaced a year later. On a Saturday afternoon, a friend and I decided to catch a movie at our local theater. After the film concluded, I excused myself momentarily to refill my popcorn. As we made our way back to the car, engrossed in a conversation about the movie, I accidentally spilled some popcorn on the car's floor mats. In a swift response, I hurriedly cleaned up mess by tossing the popcorn outside. It was during this seemingly innocent act that I noticed a man approaching me. "Hello?" he greeted me, his tone reassuring. "I don't mean any harm. My truck broke down, and my son and I urgently need to get to Lula. GA, my sister is sick, and she's waiting for us there. Do you have any cash you can spare?" At that moment, the connection eluded me, and I failed to recognize him as the same man from our previous encounter at the square. Oblivious to the chilling coincidence, I simply replied, "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't have any cash on us." "Good luck, and have a great day." Sensing an unsettling atmosphere, my friend and I swiftly retreated into the safety of our locked car. Only recently did I recall this incident and discuss it with my sister. To our alarm, she confirmed that the man had used a similar excuse before, mentioning the same city, Lula, GAA. The realization sent shivers down our spines, and we fervently hoped to never encounter this man again. To that man, if you ever come across this narrative, I implore you, let us never cross paths once more. Story 2. My little brother Aiden was only 4 years old when we received the devastating news that he would never be able to speak. I could sense my mother's growing concern, but it wasn't until Aiden turned 3 that panic truly gripped her. She spared no effort, taking him to countless doctors in search of answers. However, not a single medical professional could offer any explanation. It wasn't a physical ailment. He simply did not speak. He never cried as a baby, not even when he was born. He never seemed to have the desire to communicate, and his mouth only opened when it was time to eat. Aiden wasn't shy. He made eye contact and observed everything, even when you weren't looking. In light of this challenge, my mother made the decision to homeschool Aiden until he could find his voice. My father, on the other hand, seemed indifferent, preoccupied with his religious studies. They spent most of their time immersed in the Bible. My mother tried her best to teach Aiden basic subjects like math, science, and history, but she herself had little formal education. Growing up on a farm with her father, she hadn't even finished high school. However, such details didn't matter much to her. As long as she faithfully served the Lord as a devoted Catholic woman, she believed everything would work out. Aiden had a penchant for taking my belongings, particularly my records and electronic gadgets. It became such a problem that I resorted to keeping everything in a safe under my bed. Whenever I confronted him, he would deny any wrongdoing. He did the same thing to our parents, although it took them longer to catch on. When they finally discovered the truth, my father resorted to physical discipline, subjecting Aiden to a beating until he bled. Yet Aiden remained silent throughout, never uttering a squeal, cry, or whimper. He endured his punishment in absolute silence. He was my little brother, so I suppose I loved him in some way, but there was a significant age gap between us. Could I truly love someone I had never spoken to? Someone who continuously stole the things I bought? Aiden perplexed me. I never looked at him, not even when I knew his eyes were fixed on me. It made even the simplest interactions incredibly challenging, to the point where it infuriated me. Why did I have to feel so uncomfortable every evening at the dinner table? I understood that it probably wasn't his fault, but it was straining my relationship with our parents. The presence of the unspoken issue loomed over our household every single day, no matter how hard we tried to move on, and it seemed as though nothing would ever change. Though I never voiced it, there was one thought I couldn't shake. I wished my brother would simply disappear. One Sunday, during church, as the congregation settled into their pews, I noticed that it was particularly crowded that day. The service stretched on, long and monotonous as usual. Watching the clock only made it worse. But once the service concluded, something unexpected happened. Aiden handed my mother a note, scribbled with a single word: confession. My mother's face turned pale, and she showed the note to my father. He didn't seem too concerned, whispering something to my mother before taking Aiden's hand and leading him towards several members of the clergy, standing at the altar. My mother later revealed what my father had said to her. He mentioned that there might be a chance for Aiden to speak, and I was at a loss for words. What could prompt a 4-year-old to need a confession of sin? The thought amused the priest as he led Aiden into a confessional booth. They remained inside for an unusually long time, causing worry to settle within me. After 5 minutes, I grew concerned. After 10 minutes, my father suggested pulling Aiden out. Finally, after about 15 minutes, they emerged. Aiden walked out of the booth, his face beaming as he joyfully hugged my mother's leg. But what happened next was the most shocking of all. The priest emerged from the booth, his face drained of color. His eyes were filled with sorrow, as if lost in his own thoughts. We watched as he rejoined the other clergy members, who attempted to engage him in conversation, but he remained unresponsive. He couldn't speak. Story 3. This is based on a true story. From my understanding, I was not involved in the events and have only heard the story recently. Now, I am not saying this is 100% true or accurate. I personally find some of it hard to believe. They, however, swear it is the truth, and I would like to believe them. Even if this story isn't true, it is one heck of a thriller, I am writing this as a horror podcast, simply because the group that told me this story have said they wish to turn it into a podcast. I must warn you readers before we begin. Reading about, seeing, listening, or talking about these creatures will bring them to your doorstep. Please be aware, there are no known weaknesses to these creatures. They are relentless and ferocious. They hunt men as though they are animals. They do not fear any weapons man-made or otherwise. Worst of all, they take on a shape that we trust. They can be your family, friends, or even your pet. Be wary of everything. I write this now because I feel that the story must be known to all, even at the risk of my own life. What are these creatures called? The American Indians called them Skinwalkers. Those that walk the world as monsters in human skin. Other legends call them vampires, werewolves, even trolls. For the sake of understanding, I will refer to them mostly as Skinwalkers unless they take on other forms that best suit another name. The story begins in a small town in Colorado, where crime is rarely seen or heard of. Everyone knows everyone kind of town. It's small and rural, with a population of just a little over 400 people living there. Most had grown up in this town, though some, such as the Miltons, had moved in recently. Speaking of the Miltons, they were the first family to experience the events that had cost so many their lives. They weren't as friendly as the other families, even went out of their way to avoid people, but they were a part of the community. Now, we all know how it is to accept someone into our communities, whether it is through our personal circles such as social apps or drinking buddies. You take care of each other, and if anyone betrays someone in the circle, they are dealt with harshly. There are times, however, where we do not know of the betrayal until it's too late to do anything about it. This just so happens to be one of those times when the betrayal was hidden from sight. You see, the Miltons didn't move to this small rural town in Colorado to get away from the big cities nor for the fertile farmlands. Hell, they didn't even move there for the one thing Colorado is famous for, legal weed. They moved to this rural town for one reason and one reason alone. They were running from someone. Or, more accurately, something. It seemed fitting that they were the first to fall victim to the very thing they brought to this small town. No one can tell you just how it happened. They can only tell you what they saw and heard. It was a dark and dreary night as Sister Selma approached their small house out in the woods. She had regularly come out to their house to preach the great gospel and try to save at least their little one's souls. But this night was different. As she approached, her '89 Chevy had difficulty moving in the dirt driveway that led straight to their front doors. Something jumped out in front of her. It was quick, and Sister Selma barely had time to register who or what had jumped in front of her struggling vehicle before slamming on her brakes. Sister Selma's Chevy might have been old, but thanks to Clyde's boy, her brakes worked better than any of these newer automobiles, and she came to a dead stop a foot away from whatever kind of animal. For now, she was sure it was an animal that had jumped out at her. It had long black fur, or maybe it was hair. Sister Selma could not tell, but she knew. Whatever it was covered with it. Sister Selma sat in her Chevy, shaking as she stared into the eyes of this creature. She tried to make heads or tails of what it was she was staring at. She tried to call out to the strange creature, ask if it needed help. It was the Christian thing to do after all, but she found her voice strained as only a small squeak came out as the skin of the creature began to shift. Sister Selma's eyes became as round as dinner plates as she ducked her head and began to pray to the good Lord. She didn't get far in her prayer though, as a loud yelp could be heard from outside the vehicle, accompanied by the sounds of yelling. When Sister Selma looked out her windshield, she could see the young Milton boy running down the road, but no sign of the creature. Sister Selma began to relax, taking in a deep breath that caught in her throat as she looked carefully at the young man that approached her. He waved at her with his left arm. The boy's face was the last thing Sister Selma noticed. And let me tell you, the fear in that boy's eyes nearly sent the dear sister running. Now, Sister Selma was the most devoted servant of God you would ever see. Some even say she is more devoted than the Pope himself, and would gladly argue the point with anyone who said otherwise. But let me tell you, in this moment, she would have thrown her faith out the window in a heartbeat and left this town and life behind if she thought it would save her from the fear she felt. Sister Selma, albeit stupidly, clung to her faith instead, and even hopped out of her vehicle, heading towards the young man to help him. As she loaded the young man into her vehicle, she took in her surroundings for the first time since seeing that horrible creature, and what she saw makes her weep till this day. The last anyone in this small town saw of her after dropping the young Milton boy off at the local hospital, she had obviously been drinking, which was uncommon for her, and ranting about how there is no God, and later, as the death count started to climb, she left, leaving all to wonder what she saw. The Milton boy, Carl, was more inclined to speak of the events he saw play out. This, dear reader, was the point where the danger no longer followed the Miltons, but the entire town. A few hours prior to Sister Selma's encounter with the strange hairy creature, the Miltons had just settled down to eat their dinner. It was 5 p.m, the same time they always ate dinner, and Carl's pa had just returned from Mr. Douglas' farm, where he worked as a farmhand and tended to the cattle. Carl couldn't remember what they spoke of, but he did remember Sister Selma being brought up a few times, and how the family was tired of her trying to convert them to a religion that had no grounds to stand on. That was when they heard it. It started out small, almost inaudible, but the moment they heard it, they all froze. Carl, being the youngest of the children, hadn't realized what was happening, as his mom hurried him down a flight of stairs and into the basement. The noise came again, this time louder, sending his older siblings into a panic as they pushed past Carl and rushed into the basement. However, this was a mistake. A hand shot out of the darkness and wrapped around Emily's, the Miltons' oldest, throat and began to squeeze. She fought back desperately, trying to free herself of the hand, but couldn't muster up the strength she needed to pull away. In the end, the hand made a sharp, twisting movement, and the sickening sounds could be heard as poor Emily stopped moving. Carl was so transfixed on Emily that he hadn't noticed his older brother, Mark, was laying on the ground a few feet away from his sister. Mark had been the lucky one. His death was instant, or so Carl had said. He couldn't clarify if it truly was or wasn't. He could only describe the scene he saw. Mark laid on the ground, torn. It looked as though the creature that stood over Mark, a creature Carl could only describe from movies and video games as a werewolf, had almost bit clean through him and only left enough for his head to stay attached. Carl turned to run, to rush into the safety of his ma and pa, only to hear the sounds of F-a-shot as a large creature that could have been mistaken for humans steadily approached him. Carl's eyes went wide as he realized his ma was being dragged. A sickening sound could be heard. Carl fell to his knees. He didn't dare make a sound or even move. He stayed where he was as he watched as the giant man lifted his hand and brought it down onto his pa's head. Then came his turn. One of the creatures grabbed his arm, and he must have gotten an adrenaline boost or something because he fought back, pulling at his right arm, and managed to free himself as he escaped into the front yard, where he saw Sister Selma. Or, at least that is what he said. Dear reader, I am going to tell you not to trust such things. If a monster, be it man or otherwise, has the strength to crush a full-grown man, then a boy is nothing. You see, when Sister Selma finally spoke up about what she saw to the survivors of this small town, she told them that she had seen the Milton family's bodies hanging in the trees. Pieces of their bodies were missing, and even described what the young Milton boy had described. But what scared her the most was the last body that hung from the tree. It was the body of Carl torn in half. Young Carl had not survived the encounter with the creatures and sister. Selma feared that if she let on, she knew she would be the next person to hang from those trees. This is just the beginning of the end for the small town in southern Colorado. Join me next time as we explore what happens to young Carl and learn more about these creatures called Skinwalkers. Thank you to everyone who upvoted this story, and to those that gave me awards. I really appreciate the support and cannot express how thankful I am to y'all. The folks that told me this story heard through the grapevine that I published this here and want me to make the warning I sat in the beginning clear, just by reading, hearing, listening, or seeing these creatures. You are at risk of being attacked by these Skinwalkers, so please be aware.